For 3 decades, we believed we had him figured out. He had a name, a face, a place, and textbooks. Museums built full reconstructions of his features, his skin tone, his hair. He was held up as one of the most thoroughly examined human beings in the archaeological record. But a question kept nagging at the edges of the research. What if the very first genetic reading of him was flawed, and what if fixing that flaw didn't just change how one man looked, but upended our whole picture of Europe's earliest inhabitants? In Bolzano, Italy, inside the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology, a corpse is kept in a chamber that never climbs above 6 degrees Celsius, with humidity controlled to the fraction and access tightly restricted. It isn't a painting or a relic under guard. It's a 5,300-year-old body found melting out of a glacier in the Ötztal Alps in September 1991 by 2 hikers, preserved by ice and by the violent death that ended his life before farming had even fully taken hold across the continent. His name, Otzi. When he was discovered, he became a global sensation. Geneticists, forensic scientists, microbiologists, and climate researchers all converged on him, recognizing that this wasn't just a mummy, but a frozen archive of early European life. His genome was mapped, his gut bacteria studied, his final meal reconstructed almost to the minute, and forensic work pieced together what amounts to a Copper Age murder file, a victim, a weapon, a cause of death, and now a full genetic identity. The trouble started with the first genome sequencing effort in 2012. That analysis pointed to ancestry from the Caspian steppe, but the numbers didn't line up. Otzi predates the known arrival of steppe-related ancestry in Central Europe. By hundreds of years, researchers noticed the inconsistency at the time, but 2012 sequencing tools and the small pool of comparable ancient genomes weren't sufficient to resolve it. So the flawed reading stuck, hardened into consensus, and shaped every reconstruction and textbook image that followed. The culprit turned out to be contamination. Modern DNA had mixed into the original sample. Over the following decade, sequencing technology advanced dramatically, and far more ancient European genomes became available for comparison. In 2023, a team from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, working with Urac Research's Institute for Mummy Studies in Bolzano, ran a fresh, high-coverage sequencing and comparison publishing their results in Cell Genomics. What they found forced a genuine reassessment of the accepted picture. Museums had long depicted Otzi as fair-skinned with long, wild hair, an image that matched popular assumptions about what a Copper Age alpine traveler should look like. The corrected genome told a different story entirely. High skin pigmentation, dark eyes, and genetic markers for male pattern baldness. Dark skin, dark eyes, and a receding hairline. A portrait almost opposite to the museum reconstructions. What makes this especially striking is that the physical evidence had been visible the whole time. The mummy's skin has always looked dark, but researchers assumed that was simply an effect of over 5,000 years in the ice, never considering it might reflect how he actually looked. That assumption traces back to a long-standing, largely unexamined belief that ancient Europeans were light-skinned. In reality, the genetic variants for lighter skin didn't become common until roughly 3,000, 4,000 years ago, likely tied to agricultural diets lower in vitamin D compared to the fish and meat-heavy diets of earlier hunter-gatherers. Pale skin. In other words, is a comparatively recent adaptation, not a defining feature of ancient Europe. Populations across the continent, going back 4,000 years, were likely dark-skinned, consistent with humanity's African origins, and lightning happened much later in the timeline than commonly assumed. Otzi is simply the clearest, most visible case of an assumption that's now being dismantled more broadly. The revised genome didn't just change his appearance. It rewrote his ancestry. The standard narrative of European prehistory involves early hunter-gatherers, merging with farming populations that migrated from Anatolia around 8,000 years ago, followed by steppe herders, arriving roughly 14,900 years ago. The new analysis found no trace of that steppe ancestry in Otzi at all. The signal from 2012 was a contamination artifact, not a real genetic signature. In its place, an extraordinarily strong connection to early Anatolian farmers over 92 of his ancestry, stronger than any other individual genome from his era. While most of his contemporaries carried blended ancestry from hunter-gatherer Anatolian and steppe sources, Otzi's lineage looked almost untouched, pointing to a population that stayed remarkably isolated. Archaeogeneticist Johannes Krause of the Max Planck Institute noted that his ancestors appear to have arrived from Anatolia without mixing with hunter-gatherer groups. That's a strange thing to find in an era defined by migration and genetic exchange, a community that stayed apart while everyone around it was blending. The Alps themselves may explain part of it: steep terrain, acting as a natural barrier that limited contact between valley communities for generations. But it also raises a pointed question. if his community was this isolated who killed him. Someone from within his own group or an outsider from beyond the mountains. A 2019 analysis of his stomach contents showed he'd eaten a substantial meal 30 to 60 minutes before dying. Red deer ibex, einkorn wheat, and bracken, fern, notably high in fat, including fatty tissue and bone marrow. This wasn't a rushed, desperate meal, it reads, as deliberate fueling for a demanding trek. Then, within the hour, an arrow struck him from behind, severing an artery in his shoulder. He bled out quickly and fell face first into the snow, where the glacier sealed him, and his genome also revealed predispositions toward cardiovascular disease, obesity, and adult-onset diabetes, metabolic risk factors. Inherited, researchers suggest partly because his isolated population's limited genetic mixing allowed certain risk variants to persist and accumulate. His digestive tract contained a strain of Helicobacter pylori, unlike anything found in people today. The oldest such strain ever sequenced a relic from before the migrations that shaped the microbiomes of modern Europeans. More surprising, still recent research published in Microbiome in 2026 found that yeast populations in his preserved body are not simply inert. Comparing samples, taken years apart, showed shifts in yeast communities, including strains capable of breaking down disinfectants used in museum preservation, meaning some microbial activity is still occurring, even in a body kept below freezing for over 5,000 years. It's prompted new questions about whether the preservation process itself might be subtly altering the very archive scientists are trying to protect. A 2025 study in Nature Communications, led by Valentina Koya, analyzed the ancient DNA of 47 individuals who lived in the Austrian Tyrol between roughly 6400 and 1300 BCE, offering the fullest picture yet of the people Otzi came from. Most carried 80-90 Anatolian farmer ancestry, showing strong continuity with early Neolithic populations to the south and remarkably little genetic change over more than 2,000 years, even as the rest of Europe was being reshaped by successive migrations. Yet, within that stable community, Otzi stood out again. His maternal lineage doesn't match any other ancient or modern population studied, so far suggesting the men in his community tended to stay put generation after generation, while women moved in from elsewhere through marriage or trade networks. His mother's genetic line seemed to lead nowhere traceable until updated analysis identified a rare, very low-frequency modern match, meaning a faint trace of his maternal ancestry may persist in someone alive today, thinned across 53 centuries, but not entirely erased. Taken together, the corrected ancestry, the skin and eye pigmentation, the metabolic risk markers, the extraordinary isolation, and the still active microbial life inside his remains, Otzi's case has become far more than a single mummy correction. It's reshaping assumptions about who ancient Europeans were, how isolated some populations remained, even as migration reshaped the rest of the continent, and how much modern human gut health may have diverged from that of our ancestors. Comparing his ancient gut bacteria to modern strains is now feeding into research on why inflammatory and autoimmune conditions have become so much more common in industrialized populations. The reconstruction on display in Bolzano, fair-skinned, long-haired, no longer matches the science and will need to be rebuilt, not just cosmetically, but as a different story altogether, not of one man, but of an isolated Anatolian-descended farming community that persisted in the Alps for thousands of years before Bronze Age migrations eventually absorbed it into the wider genetic mix of Europe. And what still isn't known is who fired the arrow. We have the wound, the weapon, the defensive injuries suggesting a struggle, the deliberate last meal his age, his health, risks, his isolated origins, but not the identity of his killer, nor whether his death marked the first real contact between his sheltered world and the more mobile populations beyond the mountains. Otzi remains an open case, not solved, not finished, still yielding new information every time a new technique is turned on him.